Welcome to the next Whiskey Talks. My name is Andrew Nguyen, and today I'm so pleased to have Tom Dennison, founder and Chief Relationship Officer at Smart Health Catalyzer. And as well, we have Matt Martin, who is the VP of Discovery and Partnerships. And prior to joining Smart Health, Matt was also the Life Science and Microbiome Lead at the University of Chicago Polsky Center. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew.
And Tom, today you will be sharing a little bit about Smart Health Catalyzer. And then after that, we'll really get into the introduction on what does it take to start engaging on the tech commercialization space, and we'll be hearing a lot more from Matthew. So Tom, over to you for the slide deck.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, and happy to be here today. Allow me to provide some visuals as we go along here. And so in thinking about Smart Health Catalyzer, essentially what we're trying to do is tap into all the innovation in biotech and life sciences that's taking place in the Midwest. And the way I like to start is to think about what is the problem that we are trying to solve. So a couple of important stats here is, number one, we know that there are lots of brilliant scientists in the Midwest, whether universities or research hospitals, that are developing what could be life-saving, life-changing biotechnology. But the reality is that scientist at that university isn't necessarily equipped to, I would say, even start down the path towards commercialization. And that means having operational expertise in things like IP or regulatory challenges, preclinical, commercial, and so on. And on top of that, unfortunately in the Midwest, there is a huge gap between the quality and quantity of innovation that's taking place in the Midwest and the amount of venture capital. So today, again, unfortunately, biotech spinouts in the Midwest get less than 5% of venture capital in the U.S. And we are going to change that. So the question is, how do we do that? So a couple things. One is that we have built out this very, very deep bench of operational experts. We call it the ops team. And today we've got well over 150 people on our ops team. And again, they've got expertise across all things biotech, whether it's preclinical, IP, regulatory, commercial, manufacturing, you name it. We have that level of expertise. By the way, across therapeutic, diagnostic, and med device. Now, in addition to that, this gives you an idea of the depth and breadth of the experience that we have on the ops team. So on average, the folks on the ops team have about 30 years experience in a particular area. And this is the other part of Smart Health that we built out, in particular over the past 2 or 3 years. We're now working with 35 universities in the Midwest. Along with that, Mayo and Cleveland Clinic. So now, basically, what we're trying to do is identify the most promising biotechnology being developed in the Midwest. And if and when we discover something that we believe is promising, we look to build a startup around that promising innovation, around that PI, and essentially get that newly created startup from inception to Series A funding. And the reason why Series A funding is that we know typically at that point there's some sort of meaningful milestone that newly created startup has achieved. And just these are some of the folks that are on our team, all of which have many, many years of experience in biotech, in life sciences, and so on. And here's our good friend Matt Martin, who will take over from here. So, Andrew, I hope that was a good introduction for Smart Health Catalyzer and what it is we're trying to do. I guess in the end, you could summarize all of this into 4 short words, and it's Midwest Biotech Venture Creation.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. And so really what you just shared was a high-level summary of, why we're taking the next generation of research and commercializing it so that at the end of the day, patients can benefit. I think that was really the key point of that very short presentation, where the patients who are suffering, the patients who are undergoing challenging life circumstances, need this early stage research to hopefully give them a better quality of life. And so, with that, I want to pivot over to Matt. So Matt, you were working at the Polsky Center, and you were essentially doing the same thing in your previous role, except from the academic side. And I understand also you were working with a variety of PIs that were in this space. Can you share more about your perspective?
Sure, yeah. Happy to. So, my role at the University of Chicago came out of a need to, as Tom and then Andrew, as you were saying, figure out how to take some research discovery and move it forward to improve people's lives. And oftentimes when there's been a research discovery made that could have translational potential, sometimes the next steps require a little bit different mindset or different funding source or even different set of people to undertake some of the next activities. And I can talk a little bit about how this originated if you want me to, but I found myself in a role where I had to figure out how we're going to move this forward. It's like an insight around how to prevent certain bacteria from causing disease post-GI surgery in certain cases, or an insight on a type of mechanism that might be responsible for preventing fungal infections from becoming systemic infections in patients who are immune compromised. And there was a lot of times when we found ourselves saying, we've got this set of insights, we've got a vision for what some treatment could be that could help patients. How do we move to the next step? Well, let's go talk with some people who've done that before. Let's go talk with someone from the drug industry or an investor who backs these types of companies, or physicians who are treating those patients. And from what we learn in those conversations, start to fill in the dots of a pathway that may exist between the research discovery we've got, which still has a lot of uncertainty to it, and the vision for what some future therapy could be.
Absolutely. So you talked a little bit about, how you could work in the microbiome where, you were able to provide some level of nutrients that would convert or change the biome so that the bacteria would be, not to stop them from attacking the patient. Can you share about so I guess what I'm getting with that is, say I'm a PI that's currently working on research, and to leverage your example, what was that journey like from the working with the PI to actually getting some sort of outside connection? Because that's really the gap, right? The gap is, okay, this research has been proven in the lab space. Now, how do I make this viable? And what was that journey like when you were working with PI?
Yeah. So there's a lot in that, and it's a really important topic. And I think the number one thing I found was just that almost every conversation that was with an outside party was informative in some respect. So if a researcher is just getting started, I would say just have conversations. I mean, obviously you got to go into them a little bit thoughtful about what information do you share and what questions do you ask, but there are so many ways that you can learn if you haven't previously taken something down that path, that almost any conversation is helpful. In that particular case, the faculty member I was working with had been, as most academics do, he's been talking about his work at conferences for a while and speaking at invited seminars and visiting colleagues at other universities and talking about his work. And at some point, a researcher, someone with a fairly basic science perspective at a large company, became intrigued and reached out. So he went and visited their labs and gave a seminar, essentially, at the company. And they said, well, we want to learn more. And they came and visited his labs to learn more about what was happening. And in that case, it ultimately developed into a corporate partnership where the company was funding some specific projects in the lab that also supported a new company to get launched. But I think maybe what's germane to your question is that there ultimately ended up being a personal connection between in that case, the scientist at the company who had genuine curiosity and interest in the science, and the researcher who was engaging, in a scientific dialogue with this scientific colleague. It doesn't always play out quite like that. Sometimes there's not a scientist-to-scientist relationship that way, but in that case, there was one that was really very productive. And I think the basis ultimately for it became a partnership between two companies was very genuinely rooted in a friendship between those two scientists. Is that helpful?
Yes. So you made really good points. You talked about the corporate partnership funding and subsequent spin out of the company. You also talked about, having conversations. And yes, you're absolutely right. It starts with conversations. It starts with people being curious. But it's also complex. When you're working in an academic environment, it's the series and the entire value chain of the decision-making units and being the people, the departments, as well as the decision-making process, right? So I guess the other part to that, thinking from a PI that is looking to, start these conversations, what conversations did they need to have with the IP department? What conversations did they also have to have with other departments within the university? What was that like as a start?
Yeah. Let me say one more thing about building on your curiosity comments and then look back to the bit about the intellectual property and other departments. I think the curiosity is really important because it was the basis of as I said, what became a friendship there. I think the other thing that I see that works well in a lot of cases, and maybe it's partly because we're in the Midwest, it's humility. When the academic researcher goes into the conversation, and the person from the company, or in my situation now from Smart Health's point of view, but it was true when I was at the university too, go into the conversation with humility about the limitations of my own knowledge, and there's some things I know, and I know them. There's a lot of stuff I don't know, and when that comes through from both directions in the conversation, I think that there's more opportunity for genuine connections. There are times when I see a researcher at an academic institution who displays a sense of confidence about things that seem outside of their domain of expertise and maybe seem at odds with things I've heard in other places. A little while back, I heard someone say that a particular process in their lab was cheap to do in their lab. Therefore, they thought that this CAR-T therapy for patients probably wouldn't be very expensive. And I happen to have industry colleagues telling me that a CAR-T therapy is $200,000 per patient as a cost of treatment. I'm like, well, all right, so this academic researcher has made it more challenging for me to build a partnership here by asserting things that are, I think, outside of their domain of expertise. So I think the curiosity is important for that relationship building, but I think the humility is too, on all sides. But you asked about intellectual property, and the intellectual property is really important. I think the one thing that everyone should recognize at an academic institution is that you need to be speaking with the folks who are responsible for patent filings at your institution pretty early on and figure out what can you share publicly, what can you not yet share publicly. If you're going to file a patent application, when's the timeline for doing that, and then what are you going to be able to share after you file that patent application? And it's not because anyone particularly wants to be secretive, but just because if you mess that up and are then not able to get patent rights for some invention, then that's a big problem, and it's potentially not correctable. From our perspective as entrepreneurs and investors, you need to have the patent protection so that you have the long-term financial incentive to get a reward on all the effort and money that's going to be invested. And so if you don't have that, or potentially don't get that, then there's just not much to be done. So the patent office should be able to help with that.
Can I ask a quick question, just to clarify? So, putting ourselves in a position of a, PI that's working on a research project, and of course you have to file and submit and write papers, right? Speak at conferences, publish your papers for journals. At what point do we start thinking about, not just the publications and speaking at conferences, but at what point does IP come in?
Yeah, thanks for asking me to clarify that. It's unfortunately not a straightforward answer, which is why I say talk to your patent office early, or your office that handles patenting, talk to them early. I think that when you have an idea of this is what the therapy might look like for this disease or this set of diseases, you can say, antibodies that are targeting this target, or cells engineered in this way, or this combination of compounds together, or whatever it is. You say that could potentially be a therapy. Or, a diagnostic, like this algorithm that pulls together this piece of information with this one for the first time. That's probably something you want to think about whether or not you should patent it before you disclose that idea publicly. And I should stress that a public disclosure is actually, by the rules and laws of the U.S. patenting system, public disclosure is anything that essentially doesn't have the explicit expectations of confidentiality. So going to another academic institution and giving a seminar could be deemed to be a public disclosure, even if it's not a publication. Certainly posting something on your website, your research website about what you're doing is considered a public disclosure. But again, go get the advice of the folks in the intellectual property office. And for what's worth, I'm not an attorney. I'm not even a patent agent.
That makes a lot of sense. So, there will be always researchers right now that are already at that stage. So they should talk to their IP department, and then what next, right? Let's say they've filed, and so there's that the patent has been filed. At what point do they then have the opportunity to start engaging from a corporate side? Was that open?
Yeah. And to be clear, researchers can start talking about certain pieces of their work even before the patent's filed, as long as they're careful about what they're sharing and what they're not sharing. Like, you can usually say, we've got some research, I can't show you what the construct is we're using yet, but I've taken this animal model of this type of melanoma and I treat the mouse, and this is what data looks like, and showing how many mice survive and so on, and just not share exactly what they were treated with, for example. And depending on what you might potentially patent, that might be okay, and that enables a researcher to start getting some feedback from folks. So come talk to us, for one. To answer your question about how do they start, come talk to me. I'd be happy to have the conversation about what we might be looking for, what stage we think things would be ready for development. Additionally, a researcher wants to have a conversation with any sort of person who's been in the relevant industry. Most universities have a bench of entrepreneurs in residence or advisors, and to be honest, you can go look at other universities' websites for who their entrepreneurs in residence are and reach out to them on LinkedIn, and most of them are doing the work because they want to be engaged in the activities that sit at that interface between university and for-profit or startup activity. And so they're happy to at least have a conversation to learn about what's happening. And, I think the researcher can sometimes start with basic questions like, is this something that I should be trying to license to an existing biotech or pharma company, or do you think I need to start my own company to develop it? What data do you think might be necessary before we could raise money to take the next steps? What do you think the next steps might be? Questions like that can elicit a productive conversation about what the industry partner is thinking about and what they would be interested in seeing. So I guess those are some starting points sort of off the top of my head.
That's really great. Thank you, Matt. So, how would you answer those questions from putting on your Smart Health Catalyzer hat today? How would you answer those questions?
Good question. For me, and Tom, feel free to jump in here too, as you're thinking about these issues as well. For me, let me answer that at two levels. First, sort of more tactical. For a therapeutic, I want to see, ideally, some in vivo data with the construct that we think could be the therapy, and see an in vivo result that's just knock my socks off impressive. Like, this is just way better than the existing standard of care. Not just better than doing nothing, but better than the existing standard of care. or in the diagnostic space, sort of similar. Like here's some data, maybe it's a retrospective study or something, but here's some data from human patients that shows that you could have predicted that with high specificity and selectivity, and that it's better than any diagnostic for that type of indication today. But I think so. That's sort of the tactical answer. Some really impressive in vivo data, but I think the sort of more strategic answer, if you will, is that we want to see that if everything goes well, there's a predictable path from here to being in a clinical trial, that we're going to be able to project the amount of time and the amount of money it takes to get from whatever data set we have now until the clinical trial. And if it's a circumstance where there's some amount of optimization that still needs to happen and some iterations, and we're not sure if that's one iteration or 5 iterations, then it's a little bit hard to think about taking investor money, because an investor needs to get a return in a fixed period of time. And if you have to do a couple more iterations, that not just costs more money, but takes more time, which then just makes it harder to justify the investment in the first place. So it's about predictability of pathway in my mind.
Andrew, if you don't mind, I could just add to that a little bit. So one thing I think about, and you guys touched upon it earlier, first and foremost, is the who, like the person, the investigator, the scientist, and understanding and appreciating that, me as the PI, I'm really, really good at this, but I don't understand all of this. And just being open to allowing, I guess, others who are really, really good at this to augment your research. So we talk about this quite a bit, that I think about it more so that we're in the people business than we are in the biotech business. Because the one thing is that, and I grew up in an academic household, so I have the long tenured professor dad that I think has been teaching now for over 50 years. So, which is crazy to think about, but so I get sort of academia and all of that. So it's important to me in knowing that typically that person, that investigator, they're not going anywhere. They're going to keep doing what they're doing for a very long time, and will probably invent not one thing, but multiple things. And so that relationship is very, very important. But also that level of humility is very, very important. So that's sort of the who, and then thinking about the what, dovetailing on what Matt said, is that, you hear this often, unmet need, sort of cliche at this point, but that's great. But there's also substantial improvement, so as opposed to incremental. And I can give you a real world example. So we're working with a investigator, PI, right now in the immunotherapy space. And so there are immunotherapies that are incredibly effective for a percentage of the population. And for another percentage of the population, they're completely ineffective, if not detrimental. And so how can one dramatically improve the pool of people that this immunotherapy will work, which is extraordinary. So it's not necessarily an unmet need. It is an improvement over an existing technology. On the flip side, we have another startup that it's a gene therapy, and it directly impacts an unmet need for a rare indication of the eye. And so it's clear that there's not a therapy for this indication today. But we also know that this therapy that we are proposing is a platform. And so we start with this rare indication that clearly has an unmet need. And if we can fulfill that, then we have all these other indications that we can move to. So I'm thinking about it in that perspective. What is the actual impact? And this is part of our process. What is the actual impact that innovation, that invention can have ultimately on patients? So not incremental, but really, move the needle.
And Tom, both you and Matt really eloquently explained that part. I want to focus back on what Matt said about the optimization process in research. And so, obviously there's a funding component to the optimization. Would that be, I guess, for either Matt or Tom, is that too early stage for Smart Health to come in and, or then the PIs looking specifically for funding options on grants? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, so it's not too early for a conversation, first of all. To Tom's point about the who, we're really looking for partnerships and with great PIs, and we expect that their great PIs are looking for great partners too, right? That takes some time and often multiple conversations to figure out. And so sometimes having a conversation about where the research may go when optimization is still, we know it's still needed, that can be a great opportunity to start to build that relationship. And in prep for this call, Andrew, you and I obviously were talking a little bit about the conversation I had last week with someone at Michigan, where it was really a great conversation where I was telling him what we would want to see for us to be excited about and able to build a company around that research program. And but there's a conversation I had that was similar to that maybe 6 months ago from another university, where the researchers a month ago now looked back to me and said, "Hey, we've got some updates. Can we tell you about what's happening?" So I and another colleague from Smart Health got on a Zoom call with them and learned about what they've done in the intervening time. And they're still waiting for the key data readout on a new set of experiments. But the new set of experiments are actually informed by the set of conversations we had back in October or September or something. And so when we get that in, I think, June or July, we will have had 4 or 5 conversations at that point, and we'll start having a much better sense of, regardless of what the data says, and regardless of any of the sort of classical business factors, we'll really start to understand each other better at that point about how we each work, and ultimately we'll be working towards building a partnership, hopefully, that, Tom said, researchers' expertise is over here, and we're bringing a team with expertise over here, and we want to build that partnership where all the parties are playing to their strengths and doing what they do best together in a way that the whole is really greater than the sum of the parts.
And I want to come back to the word about, I think, was it you or Tom that was talking about the investor side of things? There's always a timeline with regards to investment. And more recently, the president of MIT has been talking about patient capital. What does patient capital look like from Smart Health Catalyzer's perspective, or perhaps your perspective also from the academic side, Matthew? And then we can go to Tom for the smart health side.
Yeah. I think I would say that regardless of whether you call it patient capital or venture capital or something else, it's really important to recognize the source of capital that is the SBIR program and app funding programs, and that those are funding sources that when there's really an unmet need, and a good team's working on it with a credible strategy, the optimization activities can happen that are not starting the clock and the timeline that investors look towards. When I hear researchers talk about having funded some of their work with grant money, the way I hear that is, well, any effort that I put into this now, any capital that we put into this now is going to be leveraging all that other grant money that's gone into it so far. So that's a really important source of funding, even after the company's formed. Indeed, the company needs to be formed for the SBIR route to be taken. I guess with regards to the private and patient capital question, I was part of a company, part of the founding team of a company in the early 2000s, in the early 2010s, actually right about 2010, that I think may actually ultimately be successful someday, but what's the return on the investment for the first investors that put in some capital in 2010? Well, I don't know. If the exit is in 2025, you're dividing by a big denominator there and calculating an ROI, and the details depend obviously on a bunch of things, but just that timeline is way too long for an investor to be able to say, hey, we got a great return. And so that makes it challenging to put in money when the pathway to an exit isn't yet totally clear.
Yeah, a couple things that I would add to that is, one, I appreciate, Matt, that example of, investors in 2010 and maybe they'll see a return in 2025. I think in large part, that's the problem that we are solving. So it's understanding very clearly what is it that needs to be done that will gather the interest from a few different parties. One, folks with much, much, much deeper pockets than we have, or two, folks that would acquire or license that innovation. And so what is the clearest, shortest path to getting to that point? Another thing, and this is, I appreciate the expression patient capital, but one thing that is sort of a myth in biotech is that it takes a relatively long period of time for a return. The reality is it's actually from the point of first investment to a return slightly less than what you would get in a tech startup. So that's biotech versus tech startup. So, and the reason being is that in the tech startup world, the milestones are typically around, scaling, finance, revenue, and so on. In the biotech world, milestones are determined by research milestones and not necessarily revenue. So the idea being is that if you get to a certain point, and let's say that could be, phase 2 clinical trial or phase 1 even, or what have you, at that point in time, if you've gotten that far, the likelihood of licensing or being acquired by someone else increases dramatically. So, and that time frame is typically like in the 5-year time frame. And again, that's slightly less than what you see in the tech startup world. So, while yes, 5-6 years might seem like a long time and might require some patient capital, but the reality is that is less than other, sectors, other verticals. So now, whether something actually becomes commercialized and available to patients, yes, that can take much, much longer because you have, very large, phase 3 clinical trials, which we're all much more familiar with these days. And at that point in time, there are many examples of big pharma spending hundreds of millions of dollars on that phase 3 clinical trial and it fails, which is unfortunate. But for the original startup, innovator, inventor, they've long since exited from that initial startup. So anyway, while there's a need to be patient from a venture capital perspective, there's a bit of a myth around how long it actually takes to achieve a return.
Thank you for sharing that, Tom. And so, I want to shift gears now because you said something really interesting. You said that you're focused on the people, and ultimately it's about people helping people and finding that synergistic win-win connection. So Tom, can you share more about, at the heart of what you're doing, you're looking at building relationships, and you used one really exciting word, which was humility. And so that really brings me to the heart of my question. What is the culture that you are trying to build at Smart Health with the researchers and PIs?
I really appreciate that question. I really do. And here's the thing, is that we recognize, going back to the premise of Smart Health in general, that there's a lot of innovation taking place in the Midwest. And what keeps us awake at night is the idea that the vast majority of those innovations will never see the light of day, meaning that they will never even get close to helping patients in the real world. And so what we recognize is that in order to solve for that, given that, the Midwest is not Cambridge, it's not San Diego, it's not South San Francisco, it's dispersed. So the only way that we can accomplish that across the region, we believe at this point, is to create a community. And it's through that community that, people express their desire, their passion to solve for that. And so that's why, again, going back to the premise that it's all about the who, we're sort of all in this together. And that really touched on something I think is important, that there is this sort of weird Midwest kind of attachment to, of that concept itself. We're all in this together. We want to lift up the Midwest and make it, I use the expression, transform it from flyover country to really a hub for innovation in life sciences. So I think if somebody is open to being part of that community and being a part of that solution, that's really what we're looking for. And I fully recognize, and we've experienced this many times over, where someone is not open to that. And that's fine. If they choose to go it alone, that's great. We say good luck, pleasure to meet you, and so on. But if somebody is willing to embrace the concept that, that it does take a community to solve for this and to be a part of that, because the reality is, like a PI today, if we build a startup around that PI today, 5 years from now, that PI could be on another startup or do something else. And it's kind of this idea of building this community where we've got all these interchangeable parts But in the end, we're unleashing all this innovation that's taking place in the Midwest. And in order to do that, each person who becomes a part of that community needs to understand and appreciate what they're good at and what they're not.
I might just add in, from my perspective, one of the things there's a bunch of stuff in that that's critical and important about building great culture. And I think the piece about improving people's lives comes back again and again. And it's, I think for all of us, it's at some level it's personal in terms of patient outcomes. We've all have ourselves or family members or other loved ones with various conditions that could be improved or diseases that cause problems. But it's also improving people's lives in a more day-to-day way as well, in terms of if I can have a conversation with someone at a tech transfer office and offer some feedback on how a technology might be improved, that helps them do their job. A conversation with a researcher about how we think about an opportunity, about where the research program's headed. Hopefully that's helping both of us do our jobs better. And all the time, we're making introductions to people on our ops team, that team of people that Tom mentioned who have a deep industry experience. And if we can connect them to a new opportunity, even if it's not a smart health startup or smart health gig, that's great. We're helping add some value there that is just, to Tom's point, kind of additive to the whole ecosystem. And so there's that sense of improving people's lives in our day-to-day activities too, that I think's, in my mind, a pretty important part of the culture that we're building here.
Those are such great points, Tom and Matt. And which really brings me to my favorite African proverb, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's really at the heart of the concept of Ubuntu. I am because we are, right? It takes a village to raise a child. And really it's that sense of community and alignment that is so key to success in any sort of entrepreneurial venture. So I want to come back to Smart Health Catalyzer side. In our previous conversations, Tom, you said that this is a virtual program. And so I want to hear from both your perspective as well as Matt's perspective. Does it make sense to keep the PIs and founders where they are? And what do you want to see happen because of that?
I'm happy to go first. It is actually our preference that PIs stay where they are. Keep doing what they do best and keep innovating and so on. And all the while, we'll do what we do best, and that's to spin out that innovation and move it into the real world, if you will. So I would say that's kind of first and foremost. I don't know, Matt, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think in my mind it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about creating partnerships that enable everyone to play to their strengths. And when a researcher is great at doing research and in many cases wants to think more about the mechanisms of action of and the pathways in some biological process, that's great for the company in the long run. That understanding will add to what the company is trying to do. But it's different in most cases than taking an asset through IND-enabling studies so you can get it into the clinic and then test it in humans. And so that means that to take it down the development path, we're going to go find CROs that are experts at doing the specific activities that need to be done to get the compound into the clinic. And that we want to have a relationship with the PI where the PI is involved in that process in the sense that they're helping us figure out who are the right CROs to use, and are they doing the right experiments, and how do we modify the experiments, etc. CRO meaning contract research organization, and we just lost time, it looks like. And so in most cases that means the PI is staying in their lab and we're building a virtual company. I might just slightly tweak what I heard you say earlier about how we have a virtual program. It's actually not really a program because each opportunity is unique, and we're building a specific development plan for each asset that is customized to the opportunity of that particular asset. So I don't think of it as a program so much as a set of virtual companies.
Yep, agree. So, on the researcher and PI side, I'm sure they would also like to understand how is Smart Health funded, and the point by which they, engage with Smart Health. How does that process work? Because you guys bring on the team, the ops team, you engage with the researcher and the innovations. How does this, work in terms of funding, from a funding perspective, and getting involved with Smart Health?
Yeah, so great question. And so think about it in this way. And you started to describe it as that it's kind of the proverbial three-legged stool. So we're looking to the PI with the innovation, first leg. Second leg, operational expertise coming from our ops team. And the third leg is capital. And the way we're funded today is that we've got access to capital. So we have a number of capital partners, whether it's VCs, family offices, corporate VCs, and foundations. And really it can be any combination of those. So to give you a real-world example, last startup we created, the seed funding for that startup, which amounted to, I think it's about 900K, came from two sources. One was VC, and that focuses on biotech, and the other is a foundation. So, and with those two, they ended up filling out the round. And actually then while we're doing that, we're also thinking about the next round of funding. And so I'm a big believer in engaging with capital early and often. So if you can engage potential Series A investors as you're doing and performing this research and get them engaged and bought into, if all goes well, you will then be interested in investing. So it's really kind of building out a network of possible, capital partners.
And are there also, like you talked about medtech, do you also have medtech and pharma companies also as investors as well then?
Yes, we do. So maybe a simpler way to look at it is that biotech might be a bit of a misnomer, but it's really anything that requires regulatory approval. So therapeutic, diagnostic, or med device. And now, of course, there's lots of, overlap even across those three. Now including things like AI and such, particularly when you're talking about diagnostic or developing potential therapeutics, but yeah, also med device.
Awesome. I want to thank you, Tom and Matt, for your time with us today on Whiskey Talks, and we will see you at the next one.
Really appreciate it. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Good to be here.